Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 2, Global Climate Finance Architecture in Major Funds, under the Learning Series Climate Finance 101, Fundamentals, Architecture, and Risk-Informed Financing Pathways. In Module 1, we introduce the fundamentals of climate finance, what it means, why it matters, how finance is categorized, and why access, affordability, predictability, and equity are central to climate action. In this module, we move one step further. We look at the architecture through which climate finance is governed, mobilized, channeled, accessed, and implemented. This architecture is not a single system or one global fund. It is a complex landscape of climate funds, development banks, bilateral providers, UN agencies, specialized facilities, national institutions, and delivery partners. The aim of this session is to help participants understand the major channels in the system, their broad roles, and how they can support risk-informed and early action financing. This module is organized into 7 parts. First, we will understand the global climate finance architecture and its major channels. Second, we will examine UNFCCC climate funds and their broad roles. Third, we will look at multilateral development banks, bilateral finance, and other channels. Fourth, we will discuss access pathways from readiness to programming. Fifth, we will examine risk financing instruments within the climate finance system. Sixth, we will apply these ideas through an illustrative country case. Finally, we will close with a short reflection and knowledge check. We begin with the global climate finance architecture. For countries seeking climate finance, the challenge is not only to know that funds exist. The more practical challenge is to understand which channel is suitable for which purpose, what requirements must be met, who has the authority to endorse or submit proposals, and how international finance can move into national implementation. This is especially important for risk-informed and early action approaches. A country may need long-term adaptation finance, support for climate information and early warning systems, readiness assistance, and prearranged finance that can be released quickly when a forecast or trigger indicates an emerging hazard. Therefore, the architecture should be understood as a set of complementary channels rather than a single entry point. This slide presents a simplified map of international public climate finance sources and mechanisms. The landscape is grouped into 3 broad areas: UNFCCC finance mechanisms, non-UNFCCC finance mechanisms, and bilateral country funds. UNFCCC-linked mechanisms include the Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facility, Adaptation Fund, Special Climate Change Fund, Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. These are closely connected to the international climate regime and are important for concessional finance, adaptation, readiness, and support to vulnerable countries. The second group includes non-UNFCCC mechanisms, such as multilateral development banks, UN agencies, the climate investment funds, the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, and the Climate Risk and Early Warning Systems Initiative. The third group includes bilateral country funds, such as Germany's International Climate Initiative, Norway's International Climate and Forests Initiative, and the UK International Climate Fund. This slide helps us move from listing institutions to understanding how they function. UNFCCC-governed climate funds operate under the UN climate regime and often provide dedicated concessional finance, readiness support, adaptation funding, and support for developing country priorities. Multilateral development banks operate through shareholder-based governance and provide scale through loans, guarantees, policy finance, infrastructure finance, and co-financing. Bilateral channels support technical cooperation, grants, concessional loans, and country partnerships. UN delivery channels and specialized facilities fill important gaps in climate services, early warning, observations, implementation support, and humanitarian-linked anticipatory action. For early action financing, this distinction matters. One channel may finance hydrometeorological systems, another may support anticipatory cash transfers, while another may provide contingent credit or insurance. The task is to match the need with the right channel. This diagram illustrates the complexity of the global climate finance architecture. The purpose is not to memorize every box or arrow. Rather, the purpose is to recognize that climate finance moves through institutions with different mandates, procedures, eligibility requirements, and decision points. Dear participants, now please think in your own context: which institutions coordinate climate finance, disaster risk finance, early warning, social protection, and national budgeting? Effective early action financing often depends on how well these systems speak to each other. We now turn to UNFCCC climate funds and their broad roles. These funds are central to the climate finance architecture because they are closely linked to international climate commitments, country ownership, and support to developing countries. In this section, we will look at selected major funds and consider how they support mitigation, adaptation, resilience, readiness, and, where relevant, the enabling conditions for early action. This slide presents the core UNFCCC finance mechanism and related funds. The Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund serve as operating entities of the financial mechanism. The Special Climate Change Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund are managed by the GEF. The Adaptation Fund was established under the Kyoto Protocol and now serves the Paris Agreement. The Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage is also emerging as an important part of the wider climate finance landscape. Together, these funds help connect finance to climate commitments, national priorities, adaptation needs, and equity considerations. For early action, these funds are relevant because they can support enabling systems such as climate information, early warning, institutional readiness, risk-informed adaptation, and resilience investments. The GEF supports developing countries in addressing global environmental challenges, including climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation, chemicals and waste, and international waters. It is particularly important for enabling activities, institutional strengthening, planning, capacity development, and integrated environmental programming. Countries usually access GEF resources through GEF agencies, working with the GEF operational focal point and national partners. This means that country ownership, focal point coordination, and alignment with national priorities are central to the process. For early action, the GEF can be relevant upstream and midstream. It can support climate information, ecosystem resilience, institutional capacity, risk assessments, and enabling conditions that make anticipatory action more credible and sustainable. This slide introduces the Green Climate Fund, or GCF. The GCF is the largest dedicated multilateral climate fund under the United Nations climate finance architecture. Its mandate is to support developing countries in pursuing low-emission and climate-resilient development pathways. Access to GCF finance is through accredited entities, including direct access entities and international access entities, in coordination with national designated authorities or focal points. The GCF can provide grants, concessional loans, guarantees, equity, and results-based payments. This flexibility is important because climate problems require different financing solutions. For early action, the GCF can support early warning systems, climate information services, risk-informed adaptation planning, resilient infrastructure, readiness support, and scalable resilience investments. This slide presents the GCF's mitigation and adaptation result areas. On the mitigation side, the GCF supports reduced emissions from energy generation and access, transport, buildings, cities, industries, appliances, and forests and land use. On the adaptation side, it supports increased resilience of livelihoods, health, food and water security, infrastructure and built environment, and ecosystems and ecosystem services. This slide introduces the Adaptation Fund. The Adaptation Fund focuses on concrete adaptation projects and programs in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. It is known for supporting practical and localized adaptation action, including water management, agriculture, coastal resilience, food security, disaster risk reduction, ecosystem-based adaptation, and community resilience. A major feature of the Adaptation Fund is direct access through national implementing entities, alongside regional and multilateral implementing entities. This can strengthen national ownership and implementation capacity. For early action, the Adaptation Fund is relevant because many concrete adaptation actions, such as early warning, community preparedness, climate resilient livelihoods, and local risk reduction, create the foundation for anticipatory and timely action. We now move beyond UNFCCC-linked funds to other major channels of climate finance. This is important because while UNFCCC-linked funds are central to the climate regime, multilateral development banks and bilateral providers account for very large volumes of climate-related finance and technical support. MDBs can provide scale, policy dialogue, infrastructure finance, guarantees, analytics, and co-financing. Bilateral providers can support country partnerships, technical cooperation, capacity development, and sector programs. Specialized facilities can support early warning, observations, anticipatory action, and resilience systems. The focus in this section is therefore on complementarity, how different channels serve different financing needs. This slide presents examples of MDBs and their climate finance roles. The African Development Bank supports adaptation, mitigation, green infrastructure, agriculture, water, energy, and resilience in Africa. Its work on disaster risk financing and climate risk insurance is directly relevant to early action, particularly through instruments that help countries prepare financially for climate shocks. The Asian Development Bank supports low-carbon development and climate and disaster resilience across Asia and the Pacific. Its relevance to early action lies in climate risk management, disaster risk management, resilience planning, and risk-informed investment design. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank focuses on climate-aligned infrastructure, including renewable energy, transport, water, urban systems, and resilience-oriented infrastructure. Its work can help ensure that infrastructure investments are designed with future climate risks in mind. This slide continues the overview of MDB roles. The European Investment Bank, Inter-American Development Bank Group, Islamic Development Bank, and World Bank Group all provide climate finance through different mandates, regions, and instruments. A key point is that MDBs do not only provide money. They also provide analytics, policy support, technical assistance, guarantees, contingent financing, and implementation capacity. For early action financing, MDBs can support disaster risk management, CAT-DDO type instruments, contingent credit, hydromet systems, adaptive social protection, climate risk screening, and fiscal resilience. These instruments are particularly important for governments that need predictable financing before or immediately after climate-related shocks. This slide shows the increasing role of MDBs in climate finance, especially for low and middle-income economies. Please examine which MDB acts as the major contributor for low and middle-income economies versus high-income economies. Yes, you guessed it correctly from the figure. It is European Investment Bank for high-income economies and World Bank Group for low and middle-income economies. The figures indicate that MDB climate finance to low and middle-income economies has increased significantly over recent years. This demonstrates the growing role of development banks in financing climate action at scale. However, volume alone does not tell the full story. This slide helps us understand what MDB climate finance is financing across mitigation and adaptation. Can you examine which sectors receive the maximum financing from MDBs for both mitigation and adaptation? Finance is often concentrated in sectors such as energy, transport, buildings, industry, and cross-sectoral investments. From the figure, it can be seen that not every sector receives equitable funding. This slide highlights the instrument mix of MDB climate finance. MDB finance is often dominated by loans, especially investment loans and policy-based lending. This is suitable for some investments, particularly large-scale infrastructure or revenue-generating sectors. However, it raises important concerns for countries facing debt stress or financing needs that do not generate direct financial returns. For adaptation, resilience, and early action, the quality and terms of finance are especially important. Grants and highly concessional finance may be more appropriate for public goods such as early warning, preparedness, community resilience, and support to vulnerable groups. The key takeaway is not that loans are inappropriate, but that instruments must be carefully matched to purpose, risk, and country context. This slide highlights the regional distribution of MDB climate finance. Finance is not evenly distributed across geographies or income groups. Some regions receive larger absolute volumes, while others may face higher vulnerability, lower fiscal space, and greater dependence on concessional resources. This is why climate finance must be assessed against need and vulnerability, not only against volume. A region receiving less finance may also be one where climate risks are severe, institutional capacity is constrained, and adaptation needs are urgent. This slide brings together an important comparison. UNFCCC-governed funds are central for norm setting, concessional finance, readiness, adaptation, and support to vulnerable country priorities. MDBs provide larger volumes of finance and can combine policy reform, infrastructure investment, analytics, guarantees, and co-financing at scale. These roles are complementary. A country may use readiness support from a climate fund to strengthen pipelines, GCF or adaptation fund resources for adaptation programming, and MDB finance for larger-scale infrastructure or contingent credit. This slide introduces major bilateral climate finance providers. Japan, Germany, the European Union, France, and the United States are among the major providers of climate-focused bilateral development finance. Bilateral finance can support technical cooperation, policy dialogue, sector programs, grants, concessional loans, and co-financing. Bilateral channels can sometimes be more flexible than large multilateral funds, but they also reflect provider priorities and strategic partnerships. This slide introduces specialized channels that are directly relevant to early action. Climate Risk and Early Warning Systems, CREWS, supports least developed countries and small island developing states to strengthen forecasting and early warning systems. This is fundamental because early action depends on credible forecasts, risk information, warning dissemination, and institutional coordination. Systematic Observations Financing Facility, SOFF, supports countries with severe weather and climate observation gaps. It helps strengthen basic observations and data exchange, which are the foundation for forecasting and early warning. FAO Special Fund for Emergency and Resilience Activities, Anticipatory Action Window, FAO Sfera AA Window, supports early action for agriculture, food security, and livelihoods. The IFRC Disaster Response Emergency Fund, Anticipatory Pillar, IFRC-DREF Anticipatory Pillar, enables National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies to act before disasters strike, based on forecasts, triggers, and early action protocols. The START Fund provides rapid financing for underfunded, overlooked, and emerging crises, including anticipatory action when warning signs indicate an imminent crisis. Start Ready is a prearranged disaster risk financing mechanism that uses risk modeling, contingency planning, and prepositioned finance for predictable hazards. OCHA Central Emergency Response Fund, Anticipatory Action, OCHA SURF AA, supports coordinated UN-led frameworks where financing is released before predictable shocks. WFP's Anticipatory Action financing supports actions that protect food security, lives, and livelihoods before climate shocks fully materialize. The climate investment funds operate through MDBs and support programmatic climate investments, including clean energy transition, resilience, forestry, infrastructure, and private sector mobilization. Together, these channels show the diversity of the early action financing landscape. Some are humanitarian, some are climate-focused, and some are development bank-linked. The challenge is to connect them coherently with national systems, climate plans, and disaster risk management arrangements. We now turn to access pathways. Access is one of the most practical challenges in climate finance. Funds may exist globally, but countries can only use them effectively if they have the institutional capacity, coordination systems, data, safeguards, pipelines, fiduciary arrangements, and implementation structures required to access and manage finance. This is equally true for early action financing. Forecasts, triggers, and protocols are not enough if institutions are not ready, delivery systems are weak, or financing cannot be released in time. This section, therefore, focuses on readiness as the bridge between climate finance ambition and actual implementation. This slide presents 3 principles for climate finance readiness: relative, responsive, and reasonable. Readiness must be relative to a country's socioeconomic, institutional, and geopolitical context. There is no one-size-fits-all model. Readiness must be responsive to the needs of stakeholders, including government, business, civil society, local actors, and communities. Climate finance cannot be effective if it is designed only from the top down. Readiness must also be reasonable. It should identify practical barriers and propose realistic steps to overcome them. For early action, readiness means that institutions know their roles, data is available, triggers are agreed, delivery channels are prepared, and financing arrangements are tested before a shock occurs. This slide presents a practical sequence from readiness to programming for early action financing. The process begins with assessing climate and disaster risks, identifying priority hazards, vulnerable groups, exposed sectors, early warning gaps, and financing needs. It then moves to defining early action priorities, such as warning dissemination, anticipatory cash, livelihood protection, evacuation support, or climate risk advisories. Countries also need to strengthen institutional readiness, map existing systems and actors, and develop triggers and thresholds. Only then can they prepare financing pathways, secure prearranged finance, develop fundable concepts or protocols, and test, learn, and scale. The key message is that early action finance requires preparation. It is not improvised during crisis. It is built through evidence, coordination, planning, and institutional trust. We now examine risk financing instruments within the climate finance system. Climate finance is often discussed in terms of long-term investments. These are essential. However, climate and disaster risks also require timely liquidity. Countries need finance not only to reduce risk over time, but also to manage residual risks when hazards occur or are forecasted. This is where risk financing instruments become important. They help governments, humanitarian actors, and communities act earlier, respond faster, and protect development gains. The purpose of this section is to show that risk financing is not separate from climate finance. It is a complementary part of a broader climate resilience strategy. This slide introduces the concept of prearranged financing. Prearranged financing refers to finance that has been approved in advance of a crisis and is guaranteed to be released to a specific implementer when a pre-identified trigger condition is met. There are 3 essential elements here. First, finance is arranged before the crisis. Second, a trigger is defined in advance. Third, the finance is released to an agreed implementer. The trigger may be based on forecasts, risk models, projected needs, impact data, or an emergency declaration. The finance may support anticipatory action, early response, or budget support. This matters because it reduces uncertainty. When risks are predictable, finance should not wait until losses are irreversible. This slide summarizes several risk financing instruments. Sovereign and regional insurance can provide rapid liquidity after major shocks. Contingent credit, including CAT VDO type instruments, provides fast disbursing finance once agreed conditions are met. Anticipatory action and forecast-based financing support pre-agreed actions before peak impacts. Scalable social protection allows governments to temporarily expand support to affected households. Contingency and reserve funds provide immediate resources for response and recovery. Early warning and hydromet support is also included because finance depends on credible information. Without reliable forecasts, impact data, and risk analysis, trigger-based action becomes difficult. The best approach is not to choose one instrument, but to layer instruments according to risk type, frequency, severity, and institutional capacity. This slide clarifies that prearranged finance is part of the broader climate finance ecosystem. It is not a separate system. Long-term climate finance reduces underlying risk. For example, resilient infrastructure, ecosystem restoration, and climate-smart agriculture can lower vulnerability over time. However, even strong adaptation investments cannot remove all risk. Droughts, floods, storms, heat waves, and other hazards may still occur. Prearranged finance helps manage these residual risks. It enables rapid, shock-responsive action and helps protect earlier development and adaptation gains. In practice, this may include anticipatory action financing, forecast-based financing, contingency funds, insurance, and contingent credit. The central message is that adaptation and early action should reinforce each other. We now close the technical sections with an illustrative country case. The purpose of the case study is to apply the architecture lens to a real country context. Instead of looking at funds as isolated institutions, we examine how different channels can support different types of climate and resilience needs. This is important because countries do not usually have one climate finance need. They have multiple needs: adaptation, mitigation, risk reduction, climate information, livelihood protection, water security, food security, and early action. A case study helps us see how these different needs can be matched with different financing channels. This slide presents Sudan's climate finance needs based on its updated NDC. Sudan's total estimated NDC implementation cost until 2030 is $8.23 billion. Mitigation needs are estimated at $4.393 billion, while adaptation needs are estimated at $3.850 billion. The government expects domestic coverage of around 15%, which indicates a significant need for international support. The sectoral breakdown is also important. Mitigation needs include renewable energy, transport, waste management, energy efficiency, and carbon sequestration. Adaptation needs include water, agriculture, public health, and coastal zones. For early action, the adaptation priorities are highly relevant. Water, agriculture, public health, and livelihoods are sectors where early warning and timely finance can reduce avoidable losses. This slide explains the focus of the Sudan case. The case is not only about funding amounts. It is about how one country engages different climate finance channels and how each channel supports different objectives. It also reminds us that implementation arrangements matter as much as the grant itself. A project's success depends on who governs it, who implements it, how national institutions are involved, how local actors participate, and whether systems are strengthened beyond the project cycle. This is particularly important in fragile or risk-prone contexts. Finance can only translate into resilience when coordination, delivery systems, institutional capacity, and local ownership are strong enough to sustain action. This slide compares several Sudan-relevant climate finance cases. The GCF case supports resilience in traditional rain-fed agricultural and pastoral systems, with UNDP as accredited entity and implementation across multiple states. The LDCF case supports climate risk finance for rain-fed farming and pastoral systems, including climate information, early warning, insurance, and microcredit. The Adaptation Fund case focuses on integrated water management, disaster risk reduction, early warning systems, and food security in the Sudan-Chad border area. The FAO Early Action example in Kassala shows how anticipatory action can protect agro-pastoral livelihoods before dry spell impacts deepen. The key lesson is that climate finance can support different layers of resilience: long-term adaptation, climate information, livelihood protection, risk reduction, and early action. A coherent climate finance strategy should connect these layers rather than treat them as separate projects. Before we close, let us briefly recap the key messages from this session. First, the global climate finance architecture is not a single fund or one unified system. It is a wide landscape of UNFCCC-linked funds, multilateral development banks, bilateral providers, UN agencies, specialized facilities, national institutions, and delivery channels. Second, each channel has a different role. UNFCCC-linked funds are important for concessional finance, readiness, adaptation, country ownership, and support to vulnerable countries. Multilateral development banks provide larger volumes of finance, policy support, infrastructure investment, guarantees, contingent financing, and co-financing. Bilateral providers and specialized facilities can support technical cooperation, early warning, climate services, anticipatory action, and institutional readiness. Fourth, access to climate finance depends not only on the availability of funds, but also on national readiness. Countries need clear priorities, strong coordination, capable institutions, credible data, safeguard systems, project pipelines, and implementation arrangements. Fifth, early action financing fits naturally within the wider climate finance ecosystem. It helps connect climate information, forecasts, triggers, pre-agreed actions, and prearranged finance so that countries and communities can act before climate-related shocks cause avoidable losses. Finally, the Sudan case reminds us that climate finance is most effective when different channels are connected across the resilience continuum: long-term adaptation, climate information, disaster risk reduction, livelihood protection, water and food security, and anticipatory action. Let us now move forward to the quick reflection and knowledge check session. Thank you for your participation and engagement in Module 2.